the sound of heavy trucks on a quiet morning, the thud of boots striking dusty pavement. In the capital of Burkina Faso, a city that usually wakes to the sound of market vendors and church bells, people instead heard the engines of armored vehicles. It was 7 o'clock, August 2025. Soldiers surrounded an ordinary office building. No banners, no warning. Inside, servers were unplugged, phones confiscated, and files loaded into military trucks. By noon, the nation's young president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, would step before cameras and say just one sentence: "Africa is not your blind spot anymore." This was not only a police action, it was a turning point. Foreign firms, long accused of spying and manipulating governments, were suddenly exposed. For years, they harvested African data in silence. And for years, silence was accepted. But silence is also a seed. What is planted in secrecy will one day grow into mistrust. And mistrust, left unchecked, will bear fruit as rebellion. The law of cause and effect was on full display. Because outside powers sought to treat Burkina Faso like a pawn, they triggered a chain reaction they did not expect. What happened in Ouagadougou that morning was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. So here is the question for us. Watching from far away, is this the dawn of a new African era, or just a single act of defiance destined to be crushed? It began without headlines. At 7 in the morning, armored trucks moved through the eastern edge of Ouagadougou. The target looked like a neutral telecom office. Yet within minutes, soldiers carried out hard drives, encrypted laptops, and humming servers. By 9, 6 other offices across the capital were hit at the same time. All were linked to Israeli surveillance networks operating quietly in West Africa. In less than 2 hours, the hidden web was torn apart. This was not an accident. For years, analysts had warned that Africa's sovereignty was being eroded not with tanks, but with fiber optic cables and corporate contracts. Those warnings were ignored. Cause met effect. Because foreign powers planted secrecy, Burkina Faso now reaped a decisive purge. At noon, Captain Traoré stood before the press. He spoke calmly. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. It was not the length of his speech, but its weight. The silence after his words was louder than any applause. Inside the city, ordinary people felt the shock. A young IT technician named Salif, who once serviced computers for one of the raided firms, told local radio he had no idea the company was tied to foreign intelligence. "I thought I was working for a tech startup," he said. "Now I see why we never met the real owners." His confusion mirrored that of thousands. Many Burkinabe realized for the first time that foreign interference did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it rented an office across the street. Numbers tell the deeper story. Over 120 million in Israeli-linked contracts were suddenly frozen. Drone systems, cybersecurity platforms, and a decade of intelligence-sharing pipelines were terminated. Within hours, ministries were ordered to shut access points. NGOs suspected of serving as fronts for espionage were expelled. Diplomats with known intelligence backgrounds were quietly escorted to the airport. No bullets, no riots, just precision. The principle of cause and effect was written across every headline. Because outsiders had treated Africa as a laboratory, the continent now treated them as trespassers. Because influence had been hidden, the response was open and final. By the next morning, images of embassy cars packed with equipment appeared in African newspapers. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was not asking permission. It was enforcing consequence. And yet, behind this bold move lay a deeper question. Was this only about dismantling spy networks? Or was it the opening shot of a larger doctrine that could ripple across the entire continent? By sunset, the tremors of Traoré's action were shaking capitals far beyond Burkina Faso. Within 72 hours, Mali froze all Israeli military imports, Guinea suspended joint cyber initiatives, and Niger opened investigations into foreign-backed contracts. 3 countries, 3 days. Journalists began calling it the West African Firewall. The cause was clear. One nation acted, and the region reacted. On the streets of Ouagadougou, the mood was not fear, but relief. Crowds gathered outside the presidential compound, waving flags and chanting. Among them stood Mariam, a mother of 3. She told a local reporter, "For years, I felt like decisions about our future were made in someone else's office. Today, for the first time, I believe my children's future will be written here, not abroad. Her words echoed across radios and cafes. Ordinary people understood the shift. When foreign power is planted in silence, it will eventually harvest resentment. And resentment, once harvested, grows into unity. The consequences for Israel were immediate. Billions of dollars in defense and tech exports were at risk. Leaked transcripts in Tel Aviv described panic. An advisor reportedly warned Prime Minister Netanyahu, "This isn't about Burkina Faso anymore. He's building a wall against us." That wall was not concrete, but it was harder to dismantle. It was collective African will. Even more telling was the international silence. France, long used to speaking first on African affairs, said nothing. Washington issued a vague call for restraint. Brussels held a closed-door session. None wanted to confirm the very accusation Traoré had leveled, that Africa had been treated as a chessboard. Their silence itself became evidence. Cause met effect, once again. Decades of interference now produced a crisis of legitimacy. But silence did not stop the people. Across West Africa, rallies spread. Students in Guinea painted banners reading, "No more shadows." Radio hosts in Mali praised Traoré as a man who did not just expel spies, he expelled our silence. Diaspora commentators in Europe and America warned that a new doctrine was being born, the Traoré doctrine. It was simple. Africa will no longer tolerate undeclared foreign influence. And here lies the deeper truth. What looked like a single purge was in fact the writing of a new rulebook. Because hidden control had been tolerated too long, the reaction now was not mild reform, but radical rejection. In Burkina Faso, NGOs were expelled within 24 hours, diplomats with intelligence ties declared unwelcome, and entire systems shut down overnight. It was the law of consequence, delayed but decisive. By the end of the week, 6 nations began drafting a blacklist of foreign corporations accused of data mining and political manipulation. The African Union discussed a resolution affirming the right of sovereign resistance. If passed, it would mark the first time the AU officially recognized covert influence as a threat equal to invasion. The question for the world was no longer whether Burkina Faso had acted too boldly. It was whether the world had waited too long, because once a principle is awakened, it spreads faster than fear. And fear was now shifting, from Africa to the capitals that once presumed to control it. The morning after the raids, life in Ouagadougou did not descend into panic. Instead, it felt lighter. Markets opened, children went to school, and conversations filled the air with a new tone. Pride. For many Burkinabe, it was as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "For the first time in years, I feel like this land is ours again," said Adama, a school teacher in the capital. He explained that his students, who once doodled flags of foreign countries in their notebooks, now sketch the red and green of Burkina Faso. The lesson was clear. When a nation asserts its dignity, even children sense the shift. Yet pride alone does not pay bills. Burkina Faso's economy is fragile. Gold makes up nearly 70% of its foreign exchange earnings, and every contract cancelled with Israel or France means short-term losses. But here, too, the law of cause and effect applies. For decades, foreign firms extracted billions while leaving little behind. Because they drained value in silence, the nation now embraces sacrifice openly. In 2025, gold prices surged above $2,400 an ounce, and the government redirected seized contracts into building a national reserve. The logic was simple. Better to face lean years now than to be bound by invisible chains forever. Politically, the consequences rippled outward. Mali, Guinea, and Niger coordinated expulsions of foreign-linked NGOs. 6 nations drafted a blacklist of corporations accused of data mining. The African Union debated a resolution that would recognize covert interference as a violation equal to invasion. This was not just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was a continental alignment, triggered by one nation's refusal to remain silent. Cause and effect again. One decision in Ouagadougou birthed a movement across borders. The social consequences were equally striking. For years, Young Africans had been leaving rural towns, chasing jobs abroad, or risking the Mediterranean crossing. But in the months after Traoré's purge, small but noticeable changes emerged. Youth groups in Ouagadougou began volunteering at community farms, chanting "Our land, our wealth, our work." The message was more than nationalism. It was ownership. Because foreign control had pushed young people away, its removal was pulling them back. But the risks were undeniable. Jihadist groups still control large parts of northern Burkina Faso. Some Western analysts warned that without foreign contracts and aid, the government would weaken. Yet on the ground, the opposite appeared. Local militias reported an increase in volunteer fighters, many saying they were motivated by Traoré's bold stance. A farmer from Kaya explained it simply: "If he is ready to stand against powerful nations, then I can stand against men with rifles." Here again, cause met effect. Foreign pressure intended to weaken the state instead stiffened its spine. For the United States, the developments carried uneasy echoes. Washington has long relied on African governments to act as quiet partners, sharing intelligence, managing migration, and securing mineral flows. If more African nations adopted Traoré's model, those networks could unravel. Already, U.S. Africa Command warned Congress that Burkina Faso's gold policies might destabilize the region. But destabilization is itself the fruit of choices. Because Washington treated Africa as a silent partner, it now faces a region unwilling to be silent. This is the paradox. The very policies meant to guarantee stability have instead planted instability. Contracts written in secrecy produced suspicion. Military bases justified as protection produced resentment. And now, the harvest has arrived. The people of Burkina Faso are no longer asking whether they can survive without Western aid. They are asking whether they can survive with it. And so, the question shifts to America. The silence of Washington cannot last forever. Analysts know that Burkina Faso's rebellion is contagious. If Mali, Guinea, and Niger continue to follow, the firewall could stretch across the Sahel, locking out not only Israel but also Western influence at large. The law of consequence is already in motion. What began as an office raid now threatens the balance of U.S. strategy in Africa. In Washington, analysts struggle to frame the events without confirming Traoré's accusation. The State Department urged dialogue, but privately, Pentagon briefings admitted that a new pattern was emerging. One advisor to the Senate Armed Services Committee said bluntly, "If two more African countries follow this model, our entire grid of partnerships collapses." His words, though not public, spread through think tanks. Markets responded instantly. Gold climbed above 2,450 an ounce as investors scrambled. Contracts worth nearly $2 billion, tied to Israeli defense firms in Africa, were suddenly frozen. For Europe, the stakes were equally high. Uranium from Niger and gold from Burkina Faso had long been silent pillars of European energy and currency stability. Now silence itself was breaking. Cause and effect again. Because the West relied on quiet compliance, it now faces loud rejection. France remained cornered. President Emmanuel Macron convened emergency meetings, but even allies in the European Union warned him that aggressive retaliation would only confirm charges of neo-colonialism. In Brussels, diplomats whispered that Traoré has trapped us in his narrative. The very absence of a coherent Western response revealed the truth. Power was shifting, not by negotiation, but by consequence. In the United States, the debate grew sharper. Some policymakers argued for sanctions, others for engagement. But the deeper fear was not sanctions or lost contracts, it was the precedent. Because once one nation demonstrates independence without collapse, others will test the same path. And once the law of cause and effect is set in motion, it rarely stops at one border. Across African diaspora communities in New York, Paris, and London, rallies spread. Signs read, "Hands off Africa and no more puppets." These were not fringe protests. They were signals of a new political force, one connecting African sovereignty to Western domestic politics. What began in a Burkina Faso office building was now unsettling debates in Western parliaments. The question whispered in Washington was no longer whether Traoré had gone too far, It was whether his defiance was only the beginning of something larger. The dust of Ouagadougou has settled, but the storm it unleashed is only beginning. Across the Sahel, governments are weighing choices once thought impossible. In Bamako, Conakry, and Niamey, leaders speak of sovereignty as if it were currency. And in capitals from Washington to Paris, officials whisper about instability. But instability is not born from dignity. It is born from decades of ignoring dignity. Cause and effect once more. Because outside powers dismissed Africa's voice, Africa now speaks louder than ever. The risks remain. Jihadist groups in northern Burkina Faso are regrouping. Foreign investors are withdrawing. Shortages of fuel and medicine may appear in the weeks ahead. Yet pride is a powerful shield, and unity even more so. If the people believe they are charting their own future, they may endure more than the world expects. The next 30 to 90 days will be critical. Expect further expulsions of foreign NGOs. Expect new contracts with Russia, Turkey, and China. Expect African Union debates to intensify, perhaps even leading to a Sahel-wide doctrine of non-interference. For the United States, the danger is not just losing contracts, it is losing trust. And trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. So what should we, watching from afar, take from this moment? That every action has a consequence. That seeds planted in secrecy will one day grow into storms. And that silence, too, is a choice. One that eventually bears its own fruit. The law of cause and effect is not only African, it is universal. If it were your town, if it were your children's future, what would you want your leaders to do? Would you want them to bow quietly or to stand, even at a cost? These are not distant questions. They are questions of family, safety, and dignity, the very foundations we all cherish. May we too choose wisdom and dignity, not just for Africa, but for our children, and for the generations that will ask us one day, when the world shifted, where did you stand? When we step back from the daily headlines, one truth remains. History always keeps its own balance sheet. What a person plants, what a nation tolerates, what powers impose in silence, all of it gathers weight. And sooner or later, that weight tips the scale. That is the essence of cause and effect. In Burkina Faso, foreign contracts were signed behind closed doors, data was extracted without consent, and security was outsourced to outside hands. For years, these actions looked profitable, even safe, but silence itself was the seed. Because the cause was secrecy, the effect became mistrust. And mistrust, left to grow, always produces rebellion. What we saw in 2025 was not a surprise. It was a harvest. This is why cause and effect feels so deeply fair. No action disappears. It may be delayed, it may be hidden, but it never vanishes. If interference is planted, resistance will sprout. If dignity is denied, pride will return. That is not ideology. It is simply the pattern of life. Older generations in America know this well. We have seen families broken when truth was ignored. We have seen communities heal when justice was restored. We have witnessed wars fought because arrogance refused compromise, and peace gained when humility was finally chosen. In every case, the chain was visible, cause then effect. That same law now speaks across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. Consider the paradox. For decades, the West claimed to bring stability through contracts, aid, and bases. Yet the result was not stability, but resentment. Why? Because the cause, hidden control, was never honest. The effect could only be revolt. And revolt, though costly, carries its own balance. It restores what was denied, the voice of the people. The fairness of cause and effect lies in this. It applies to everyone equally, whether powerful or weak, whether a superpower or a small landlocked nation. No one escapes the weight of consequence. A soldier who abuses power may win for a day, but he plants a seed of resistance that will rise tomorrow. A leader who stands for dignity may suffer today, but he plants trust that will flower in years to come. No law, no weapon, no propaganda can cancel this equation. And so, for us watching far from Africa, the lesson is not abstract. If our own leaders treat nations as pawns, if they write contracts in secrecy, if they ignore the dignity of ordinary families abroad, then the consequence will reach us too. Because mistrust does not stop at borders. It crosses oceans, it shapes markets, it shakes alliances. The cause may be planted in Ouagadougou, but the effect will be felt in Washington, New York, and every home where trust in leadership matters. But there is also hope in this law. Just as injustice bears revolt, justice bears peace. When communities choose honesty, when nations choose fairness, when leaders respect the dignity of others, the effect is stability that no weapon can guarantee. Look at history. Germany and Japan, once enemies of the United States, became partners not because of force alone, but because fairness was restored. Cause and effect again. Respect planted, trust harvested. In Burkina Faso today, the sacrifices are real. Shortages may come, dangers remain, but the people accept them because they believe the cause is right. And when the cause is right, even hardship feels lighter. That is why men volunteer to defend their villages. That is why mothers tell their children to study harder, to carry the nation's colors with pride, because they believe what is planted today will grow into a stronger tomorrow. For us, the question is simple. What seeds are we planting? Are we choosing secrecy or honesty? Domination or respect? Fear or dignity? Because the harvest will not miss us. It never does. If we plant arrogance, we will reap isolation. If we plant care for the vulnerable, we will reap loyalty and peace. The fairness of cause and effect is that it belongs to everyone, whether we believe in it or not. So as we close this story, let us remember, cause and effect is not punishment. It is balance. It is the quiet accounting of history, keeping track when newspapers forget, when leaders change, when memories fade. Every step leaves a trace. Every choice writes a line. And one day, those lines add up. If your children asked you tomorrow, what did you do when the world shifted? What will your answer be? That you bowed in silence? Or that you stood for dignity, even when it was costly?